In the early 1990s, I remember reading in my high school French textbook that only 50% of French people had phones. My first thought was, that can't be true. And at that time, I had no way to find out. There was no Google nor really much of an internet at that point. I just had to make do with little bits of secondhand information and hold on to my curiosity for a bit. Fast forward to 1999 when three things happened. One, an American commercial was advertising a new version of a popular meal in a box. This meal in a box is known for its fluorescent orange cheese powder and only takes 10 to 12 minutes to make. But the ad was now promoting a microwavable 4-minute version. Two, José Bové, a French farmer, destroyed a McDonald's restaurant in the south of France. And three, I was a fresh-faced university graduate leaving the US for a language assistant job in France. I was anxious to leave the land of fluorescent orange cheese and 4-minute meals, and impatient to get to the promised land of long lunches and wine. And before we go any further, let's get one thing straight. I wanted to do much more than scratch the surface. I had a seat at the table and I was ready to dig in. I had a million questions. How do French people maneuver tutoiement, vouvoiement, and la bise? Why are coffees, cars, and refrigerators so teeny tiny? Why is there so much dog poop on the sidewalks? Is it true that only 50% of French people have phones? Do they really say zut alors and ooh la la? Why don't they pasteurize their cheese? Does the rude waiter really exist? Are their universities really free? Is their food really so good? And what is an apéritif? So there I was, a language assistant working for the Éducation nationale. I had French colleagues in French schools, and I was going to teach French children. In one of my first lessons, I wrote the date on the board, underlined it, and told my elementary class to copy it in their workbooks. A keen 7-year-old girl raised her hand and said, "What color should I underline the date, miss?" I was a bit surprised at the question, so I said, "It doesn't matter, any color you wish." All of a sudden, there was a flurry of pencil cases and markers appearing. I had inadvertently started a coloring frenzy and had completely lost control. What happened? Eventually, I found out. You see, there is a very specific color coding system that French children use to help them learn parts of speech and grammar. They just weren't used to having the choice. But it wasn't in the classroom where I had one of my most memorable moments that started to pull back the curtain on French culture. It was in the school cafeteria at lunch. Imagine a long row of tables with 20, 30 people. It was the moment of the meal when the cheese gets passed around. You see, I live in Normandy, where camembert is king. No merci, I say to my table neighbor as my taste buds remind me of my previous tentatives. Je n'aime pas le camembert. I don't like camembert. Ah bon? Said my table neighbor with genuine surprise. Then I heard, of course she doesn't like it. That camembert has no taste, referring to the factory-produced, pasteurized version going around. If she ever tried real camembert from a farm, that would be another story. And here's where the fun starts. The discussion was now table-wide, and I got an earful. Some had heartfelt declarations of love for camembert. Some commented about how only the good cheeses were unpasteurized cheeses. Someone else mentioned where to get the best camembert. Someone else mentioned their favorite cheese, and then pretty much everyone else chimed in, offering suggestions, advice, love stories, and soliloquies about cheese. And this scenario kept repeating itself. All this fuss about cheese. And I thought wine was the real French hero. It took me a few years, lots of meals, patience and curiosity to be able to start figuring out what was going on. And here it is. Symbols, heroes, rituals, values, and practices. This culture onion created by Gert Hofstede shows how culture is manifested. For clarification, culture can be succinctly defined as what is accepted and familiar for a group of people. To really get to know a culture, you have to dig deeper and work your way through the culture onion. So armed with this onion, I'm going to try and explain one aspect of French culture: food and eating. So pull up a chair and join me at my table. Eating. It's all good, right? It's togetherness, taste, time well spent. A good meal is as fulfilling to the soul and social fabric as it is to the stomach. And in France, eating is a serious affair. Let's start by scratching the surface. Symbols are the outermost layer. They are what we see. So when José Bové, remember him, wanted to make a statement against la malbouffe, junk food, he attacked the Golden Arches. Words and the ways we use them are also symbols. Take, for example, the word gourmand and gourmandise. If you look in a dictionary, you will see gluttony and greed, nothing less than one of the 7 deadly sins. Although in France, a gourmand is someone who appreciates high-quality food, and a gourmandise is that little bit more you are having because it's just so good. Due to their superficial nature, symbols are where stereotypes can come from, which, on the one hand, can be dangerous and counterproductive, but on the other hand, can also be a source of wholehearted fun and the window into the lower layers. For example, if you Google search French stereotypes or French symbols, you will see lots of images of cheese and baguette. Ah, la baguette. The French are so serious about their baguette, they are trying to have it internationally recognized as cultural heritage for humanity. Next, heroes. Heroes are people, real or fictional, that serve as models. In the US, the cowboy symbolizes rugged individualism and freedom of action. Under the lens of our French food illustration, well-known French heroes are celebrity chefs and food critics. But even more importantly are the family heroes that perpetuate the culinary history of the family and the region. Thanks to them, traditions are kept alive and passed along. And let's not forget the expertise and dedication of the neighborhood boulanger. And if a humble baker wants to become a hero, well, every 4 years there is a competition called Meilleur Ouvrier de France. It is a prestigious title that honors excellence and savoir-faire. There are quite a few categories, but the most publicized one is cuisine gastronomie, bien sûr. Digging deeper, we get to rituals and practices. This is the how part of the onion. This is how people make culture live and breathe by participating collectively in rituals and practices. These acts are heavy with symbolism. Think weddings, funerals, and how we express our devotion to the divine, for example. So let's get back to eating. What is accepted and familiar in France? In its simplest everyday form, practices, people eat in 2 or 3 courses. In its most elaborate version, rituals, it is saved for special ritual moments. And here's how it goes. To start, there is an apéritif, a drink or 2, alcoholic or not, and some small nibbles to wake up the appetite. After, or as an interlude to the apéro, there can be a mise en bouche. This is a well-crafted, more sophisticated nibble, signaling that the meal is going to start soon. The meal now begins with a small savory dish, aptly named the entrée because you are entering into the meal. Sometimes there are 2 entrées if it is a really, really special occasion. Then there is the main dish, or 2 main dishes if it is a really, really special occasion. After the main meal, there is a plateau de fromage, a large variety of cheeses to choose from. The more variety is better, with bread and salad. And then there is dessert. And then there is a teeny tiny coffee. And then there is a small glass of a strong alcohol called a digestif to finish. This version is called the repas gastronomique. It can be 7 or 8 steps, but can even include 1 or 2 more, depending on the region, and last quite a few hours, depending on the occasion. UNESCO explains, the gastronomic meal emphasizes togetherness, the pleasure of taste, and the balance between human beings and the products of nature. In 2010, they classified it as intangible cultural heritage for humanity. So clearly, there is more going on here than simply satisfying our hunger. Which brings us to the heart of the onion, values. Here you have the most invisible aspects of culture. Here is where people tacitly agree on notions such as beautiful or ugly, clean or dirty, logical or illogical, and the biggest of them all, right and wrong. So let's step away from our dinner table just an instant while we consider an example, freedom. And let's take the 2 countries that I know best, France and the US. In France, the concepts of liberté, égalité, fraternité are enshrined in the French Constitution. And in the US, there is liberty, freedom, and justice for all, as promised in the Pledge of Allegiance. A word is indeed a simple symbol, but a country's institutions and people make the word and its concepts live and breathe. And both these countries have governments and institutions that are built on the value of freedom. I started to understand the French notion of freedom when I started understanding their healthcare system, subsidized housing, their education system, and why they demonstrate and strike. French people are always quick to criticize the imperfections in these systems, but I was impressed. And then intrigued. The US and France use the same word, freedom, but are using it to justify completely opposite phenomenon. From my perspective, I understood a deepening of meaning, a deepening of perspective, not a contradiction. We need to understand that values and value concepts live and breathe underneath the layers of symbols, heroes, rituals, values, and practices. So back to 1999 and that fresh-faced graduate. A few hours after my arrival in France, I was enjoying an impromptu champagne aperitif at the school where I was a language assistant, with the teacher who was my tutor and the principal of the school. Once my French ran out, which didn't take very long, they started to have a very intense discussion that, as far as I was concerned, was going to get my tutor fired. There was serious disagreement between them. Later, I asked her, "Aren't you worried about the principal firing you?" She said, "He can't fire me." And she stated it as if it were a simple fact. My American brain thought, how is that possible? In the States, you can get fired for almost anything and in any manner of ways. You see, in the Éducation nationale, they run a very complex nationwide administration that places people in schools based on very complex ranking systems. And everyone is at the mercy of that system, teachers and principals alike. So no, he could not fire her. She was free from the worry of being fired for speaking her mind about the changes the new education minister was making. A few weeks later, there was a nationwide strike against these new measures, and I got to see an entire country of teachers exercise their freedom to strike and be heard because they were also free from the fear of being fired. Let's come back to our meal. As I look around my table, I think about my experiences over the years and the guests I have gathered. I look over and I see France, a country that has 1,200 varieties of cheese and loves fast food. And there they are, chit-chatting and congratulating America, a country of 4-minute meals, and who has recently won the World Cheese Award. And I sat them next to each other because for me, juxtaposing opposites is not always a contradiction, but a welcoming of diversity. The spice of life, so to speak. And at my table, there is always room for others. And when they come, I'll switch their seats around so everyone can have a new perspective, because the more people that are at the table, the richer the meal becomes. So, like preparing a good meal, experiencing culture is like simmering this culture onion until it's all fallen apart and the layers have disappeared. Then you add some more ingredients and turn it into, say, French onion soup. You can't see the layers or taste the individual ingredients, but if you have the patience to let it simmer, the opportunity to have a seat at the table, the curiosity to taste the soup, and the presence of mind to be humble when faced with confusion or a very stinky cheese. This is the recipe for discovery, because that stinky cheese you just ate might be an entire culture onion in just one bite.